Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It's an honor to be with you all virtually today as we gather to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, officially observed on January 27th each year. While I would love nothing more than to be together in person, the safety of our visitors and guests is our first priority. So thank you for joining us virtually. On January 27, 1945, Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi death camp. Between 1942 and 1944, over 1 million people were murdered there, the vast majority of them Jews. In 2005, the United Nations designated January 27 as a Remembrance Day to honor all victims of the Holocaust: men, women, children, Jews and Christians, homosexuals, Roma, Sinti and Lalari, and people with disabilities. Today, we honor and remember each of those lives. Upon issuing the resolution, the UN urged member states to develop educational programs to instill the memory of the tragedy in future generations to prevent genocide from occurring again. At the museum, we live this charge each and every day through our mission to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. But we also acknowledge that our work is not yet done and that hatred persists. Just a week ago, we saw yet another act of anti-Semitic violence as a gunman entered Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, just 30 minutes from our home, during Shabbat services, taking 4 hostages, including Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker, and sparking a tense 10-hour standoff. I want to take a moment to thank law enforcement and first responders for the safe rescue of the hostages, and local faith communities for their support and prayer, and to send thoughts of healing support to Rabbi Charlie, the other hostages, and the congregation Beth Israel. While it is a huge relief that the hostages escaped physically unharmed, it is disheartening, to say the least, to see yet another example of virulent anti-Semitism in our country. We hope that all communities will stand in solidarity with their Jewish friends and neighbors to condemn actions that divide us. We will continue to educate, to build awareness, and to promote human rights for all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, faith, or background, to create a community of upstanders. And it's an honor today to recognize a very important group of upstanders, our survivors. These men and women are the heart and soul of our museum, and they remind us every day of the best of humanity. I appreciate you all being with us to help us celebrate and honor them. And I'm just sorry that we couldn't be together in person to give them a hug. As you all joined our program today, you saw the names of our local DFW survivors, hidden children, refugees, and kinder transportees. I'd now like to take a moment to remember the survivors we lost in 2021. Edith Baker, Leon Baxt, and Andrew Rosenberg Bramley. May their memories be for a blessing. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Julie Metal Berman and Mark Jacobs, both second-generation survivors who speak to students at the museum. And I appreciate them being with us today as we come together to remember the victims of the Holocaust. Today, we will hear from Julie and Mark about their parents' stories, the importance of remembrance, and their experiences as children of Holocaust survivors. I'd now like to invite Julie to share some of her parents' stories. Julie?
Thank you, Mary Pat, and thank you for having me today. So I'd like to tell you about my parents. both of my parents were survivors. They both came from Hungary. And their story is a kind of a love story, because when Poland was invaded by the Nazis, Hungary did not actually join the war yet. But Hungary was a very anti-Semitic country, and they sympathized with the Nazis. So the first order was that everyone over the age of 18 had to enlist, all the men. And of course, my father enlisted. He was 18. And soon after that, they separated all the Jews away from the non-Jews. They had to wear a yellow armband, and they were formed into slave labor groups. And they were taken all over Hungary to do hard labor in preparation for the Nazis to come in at some point. So one of the first places where my father was taken to was this small little town called Solnok, where he was building and constructing barracks for the soon Nazi army to come. The Jewish girls in that town heard about this, and they would come every day and bring things for the young Jewish men who were kept there as slaves. And that's how my father met my mother. They fell in love, and often my father would bribe the sergeant in charge to let him go and take him to visit my mom. But after 10 months, he was shipped out, and he was sent to the Russian front with his group. There, he had to lay down landmines. The Nazis knew that at some point, the Russians will try to come over that border and try to liberate Poland. So they were preparing by putting down landmines. And many of his friends from that group died because these landmines would go off. They didn't mark them, and many of them died. But my father became an asset to the Nazis because he knew how to build things. And so often the Nazis would send him to the next little town to repair wagons, to repair whatever they needed to repair. On one of these occasions, my father was sent to this little town to repair a wagon wheel. And when my father was with the owner of this shop where they fixed the wheel, the old man who owned it said to my father, "I want to show you something." And he took him to the front door, and he showed him in the middle of the town, there was a hill. He said, "Do you see that hill there?" He said, "That hill consists of 9,000 Jews. 9,000 Jews from this town and the entire surrounding area were brought here. They were made to dig a ditch, and they were shot and killed and buried there." He said that hill did not stop moving for days. My father went back to his unit, and they kept on working. But at some point, the Russians started to come over that border, and so the Nazis moved further into Poland. As they were moving in, an occasion came where a wagon broke down, and the Nazis told my father to stay there and repair it, and they moved on and left him there. Of course, my father realized this was his opportunity, and he took off. He ran off into the nearby woods, and there he met a group of partisans, resistance fighters. And so my father joined the partisans. And he would go all over. They would do any kind of sabotage, blowing up bridges, blowing up tunnels, stealing the Nazi supplies and things like that. But I'll switch back to Solnok, where my mom was. And of course, in 1944, Hungary joined the Nazis. And the Nazis came into Hungary. First order was that all the Jews had to go to the ghettos. My mom and her parents and her extended family were all sent to the ghetto in Solnok. But a couple of weeks later, they were all told that they are going to be deported. And so they were marched through the middle of the town to the rail station. and were boarded on a train with cattle cars or box cars, if you want to call them, and they were off to Auschwitz. They didn't know where they were going. They weren't told where they were going. They were just pushed onto the trains and were sent off. The train ride was 3 days long, nonstop. No food, no room to even stand, no restrooms, no water. For 3 days straight, they were on their way to Auschwitz. When they arrived in Auschwitz, men and women were separated, men on the right, women on the left. And that was the last time my mom saw her father. Sorry. My mom was sent to the barracks with the other women after going through the showers where they were completely shaved and given a smock, and then off to the barracks. Every day they were made to stand outside naked and go through selections. She talked often about Dr. Mengele being the one to select people who would live or people who would die. On one of these occasions, my mom was selected, and she was sent to a group who was going to be sent off to do labor, slave labor. But my mom was worried about her mother, and so she saw an opportunity to run away, and she ran off into a crowd of people who were standing around listening to a chaplain. And she got away from the guard who was chasing her. So from then on, my mom stayed with her mom and would hide every time there was a selection. But soon, the Nazis were afraid that Auschwitz was going to be liberated by the Russians. And so they put the prisoners on 2 trains. If you recall the Anne Frank story, Anne Frank was on one of these trains, and my mom was sent deep into Germany to Bergen-Belsen. When my mom got to Bergen-Belsen, she found her sister there and a cousin, both of them alive, who she had thought were long gone, but she found them there. And while in Bergen-Belsen, things were very bad. There was hardly any food. Hygiene was not something that they knew about. And soon the Germans realized that now, not only are the Russians coming from the West, but the British were starting to come from the East and the Americans from the South. And so the Nazis decided to move them again. But this time they couldn't get them on a train because the trains were targets for the bombings. And so my mom was taken on a death march. And they would walk through the night, mostly, through the mountains of Bavaria in Germany, till they got to Stuttgart. When they got there, they were bombarded by the Americans and the British, but they were hiding, and soon they were taken back on the road. From this road, my mom was finally liberated. And then she started the long trek back to Hungary. In the meantime, I'll go back to my father. He was with the partisans, and he was in Warsaw when the Warsaw Uprising happened. Not the ghetto uprising, but the Warsaw Uprising. And so my father and his partisan friends were there trying to keep the Nazis back and allow time for the Americans, the Russians, and the British to get there and liberate Warsaw. While he was there shooting at the Nazis and trying to keep them back, my father was shot. He was shot with a machine gun, 13 bullets across his body. He was left there by his buddies. They thought he was dead. But the Nazis came and they picked him up and took him to a field hospital because they thought he was a Hungarian patriot, just caught in the fire. They took him to the field hospital where a doctor operated on him. This doctor realized that my father was Jewish and saved his life not only by doing surgery, but also by quarantining him away from the other German soldiers there. The doctor came several times a day to change his bandages and to bring him food. One night, the doctor told him, "Tonight you need to leave. We're getting sent back to Germany and you need to leave tonight." So my father crawled out of a window on crutches and started to make his way back to Hungary. When they got back, my mom sent a telegram to Debrecen, where my father was from, and said, "I'm back, come and get me." My father went and got her, and they were married the next day. A couple of years later, Hungary became a communist country, and my father left with my mom and my older brother by then. They made their way to Israel, where they helped to establish the new Jewish homeland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Goodness, I know no matter how many times you share that story, it's hard to relive it. So thank you for sharing it with us. And now I'd like to invite Mark to share some of his father's story.
Thank you. My father was Michael Jacobs. Of course, that's his American name. And he was born in Poland as Mendel Jakubowicz in a small town called Konin, K-O-N-I-N, which is about halfway between Berlin and Warsaw. It was a small town of only about 10,000 people, about a third of whom were Jewish. He was the youngest of 6 children. His parents were Moshe. His father was Moshe, and I'm named after him. My Hebrew name is Moshe, and his mother's name was Devorah, and my sister's named after her. He was born in 1924, and his older siblings were basically couple sisters and three brothers. They had a really nice life, I think. My dad spoke very nostalgically about growing up in Konin. He had a lot of relatives, uncles, aunts, lots of first cousins who not only lived in Konin, but also lived in some of the small towns surrounding Konin. He had a really lovely voice, so he sang in the choir. The synagogue there was quite an edifice and actually survived the war. In the mid-'80s, I had an opportunity to go to Poland with my father, so I had a chance to visit the synagogue. It was quite lovely. At one point, it was restored and became a children's library. Of course, in 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, and Konin was on the way to Warsaw. And the German army, of course, came into Konin, and one of the first things they did was take the teachers, not only Jewish teachers, but also non-Jewish teachers, and shot them. They really wanted to let everybody know who was boss. At that time, it was around the high holiday period, and the German soldiers came into the synagogue and they took the Torah scrolls and the prayer books, and they took them out of the synagogue and they burned them. They instituted a curfew, and at some point, not long after that, they moved everybody into a ghetto within Konin, a small ghetto. Everybody had to leave all their belongings, and it was not long after that, a couple of months, that all the Jews of Konin were moved to another town called Auschwitz, which already had a small Jewish ghetto established. So from having their own home, their own flat, they were in a flat that they shared with 2 or 3 other families. It was a small ghetto, and of course, they weren't able to do anything. They couldn't work, they couldn't go to school. My father, fortunately, was kind of blonde-haired and blue-eyed and rather on the lean side, and also very clever. So he would often leave the ghetto and go out into the countryside and bring back fruit, vegetables, and other kinds of foodstuffs for his family and for other people who were living nearby. And fortunately, he, of course, was never caught. He spoke very proudly of being able to do this. They lived in the ghetto for quite a long time, and eventually everybody was brought to the square, the big square, and the people in the big square, which included his parents and some of his siblings, were transported to Treblinka, where they were murdered. One of his brothers and he decided not to go to the big square, and that particular brother went off and eventually joined the partisans and fought the Nazis. Unfortunately, he was killed by Polish partisans while he was fighting for Poland. My father was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and of course, he experienced Mengele, and he wound up in Birkenau because he was young and strong, and he was going to work. And while he was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, he was helping in a local scrapyard and going in and out with the train. And ironically enough, later on, he in Dallas started a scrapyard. In January, which is why we're here today, Auschwitz was liberated, but prior to the liberation, because he was healthy, he was he was on a death march back into Nazi German-controlled territory, and he wound up at another concentration camp called Mauthausen, which was in Austria near Linz. He was put into a sub-camp called Gusen II, and there he worked. And what they did is they hollowed out a mountain, and in this mountain they were producing plane parts for Messerschmitts. And during that time in Auschwitz, he was also part of the underground very quietly. And when he was in Gusen II, he was also very quietly part of the underground. And he helped sabotage some of the planes that they were building. He always spoke about his time in the Holocaust from very early on, not only what happened to him in the camps, but also what happened to him after the camps. He was liberated in May of 1945, and one of the stories he tells is he saw a tank coming in, and everybody was kind of concerned about this tank because they thought it had a star on it, and they thought it might be a Soviet tank. In fact, it was an American tank, and they were all standing and inside Gusen II. And eventually, my dad went out to see what was going on, to greet the tank, and some soldiers started throwing out Hershey's candy bars. And back in those days, they weren't the small candy bars that we all know, but they were big candy bars. And of course, he couldn't really read English, and he thought it said Herschel. So he thought they were Herschel candy bars. And that was really the first food that he had after he was liberated. Rather than going to a displaced persons camp, he and a bunch of other people went into town, and they took over an apartment, and they lived in this apartment for a short while. And then they went across the border into Germany, into Mittenwald, Garmisch, and that's where they stayed. That's where he stayed until 1951. He organized a lot of sports clubs. He competed in track and field. He taught calisthenics. He was very athletic. He actually had a fairly decent life in Germany after the war, but of course there was nothing for him to stay there for. He didn't go back to Poland because there was nobody left. He did hear that his family had all been murdered. While he was in Germany, he did manage to locate a first cousin, Avram Soika, who eventually wound up in Montreal. So he left Germany in 1951, and he came to Dallas. And of course, he knew nobody in Dallas. He was resettled here by Hias. He lived in a family home who rented out rooms. He had a job, and he made his new life here in Dallas. Of course, he came here not speaking any English. He went to Dale Carnegie to help him with his English, and he started speaking about his experiences while at Dale Carnegie. Eventually, he met my mother at the Jewish Community Center at that time. They were introduced. They got married in 1953. He started his scrapyard in 1954, and then he had 4 children. I'm the oldest. I have a sister, Deborah, and 2 brothers, Andrew and Reuben. And we grew up in a very Jewish household. We went to the conservative synagogue, Shereth Israel. We were all bar mitzvahed. My sister married and had 4 daughters, has 4 daughters and 8 grandchildren. My father, very early on, started the survivors group in Dallas back in the 70s. He and a few other survivors, Jack Altman, Max Glaubin, Sam Zor, a few others, got together and started the survivors group to not only talk among themselves. Leon Zetley was another person that they who joined that group, but also for the camaraderie, because they all shared a similar experience. My dad's goal was to start the Dallas Museum of the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and he and along with a number of these other gentlemen and other people raised the money to start the Holocaust Center, which was in the ground floor of the Jewish Community Center. And it opened in 1984. Eventually, they had temporary quarters in downtown Dallas, and then a number of years ago, they opened up the present facility. Unfortunately, by that time, my father had passed away. He died in 2014. He spoke very early on about his experiences. One of his missions was to educate people about the Holocaust. He didn't want people to forget. So after he retired from the scrap business, which was run by my brothers, he would go on and speak to anybody who would listen to him. He spoke to schools and churches and civic groups, and he wrote a memoir, Holocaust Survivor. He spoke often at the Holocaust Center. Along with my mother, they would go all over the North Texas area, into Arkansas, Oklahoma, other parts of Texas. Wherever he went, he would speak. They attended one of my niece's graduations in New York at Touro College, and he spoke to Touro College. He visited relatives in South Africa, and he spoke in South Africa. So he was very, very devoted to educating people about the Holocaust. His mantra was that you shouldn't hate, because hate doesn't do anything. You should have hope, and you should remember the Holocaust, and you should teach it so it's not repeated again. We grew up in our household hearing the stories and hearing about his family from when we were very young. It was just part of our lives. And so we're trying to carry on his mission by speaking today. And I also speak at the Holocaust Center, and one of my nieces is active with the Holocaust Museum. And of course, we are very proud of my dad. He accomplished an awful lot. He didn't let the Nazis defeat him. Obviously, he missed his family. But fortunately, he did have other relatives who left Poland prior to the war, and he was able to be in contact with them at South Africa, at Israel, and Canada. And so it was always a part of my life. And I'm very grateful that we have the Holocaust Museum, and I'm very grateful for all the hard work that Mary Pat Higgins and all the other staff put into educating people about the Holocaust. And again, we're in a difficult time where anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head, and it's our responsibility to fight the anti-Semitism. And I'm very happy and proud that the Holocaust Center is doing that as well. And remember, for all of us, we just have to remember what happened, teach it to everybody, make sure it doesn't happen again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I mean, we are so grateful for your father's vision and drive, and that of the other Holocaust survivors that he worked with to build our museum. As we understand it, it was one of the first Holocaust museums in the country, and have such a small group of survivors here, that was really quite an undertaking. And I'm not sure if you mentioned that him being instrumental in getting the boxcar from Belgium.
I did not. Yes.
I thought you did. And
right.
As far as we know, we were the first museum in the
That's
world
correct.
to have a World War II era boxcar in our museum. And so his vision was pretty amazing. Thank you so much for carrying on his legacy and sharing his story. Now I'd like to invite Julie to come back and join us, as well as Dr. Sarah Abosh, Barbara Raven, Chief Education Officer at the museum, for a conversation about with Mark and Julie about their family's experience.
Thank you, Mary Pat, and thank you, Mark and Julie, for sharing what I know is a painfully abbreviated version of each of your parent stories. We're going to have a conversation about Holocaust memory and the sharing of stories. But before we do that, Mark, behind you on the wall of your office is a painting of a shepherd dog.
Right, a German Shepherd.
A German Shepherd, right.
There you go.
And as somebody who's a Holocaust historian and also somebody who is aware of how shepherd dogs, German Shepherds, were used in the camps, can you explain a little bit about your family connection to those dogs? Because it's very interesting.
Sure. So when I was born, my parents had a German Shepherd. And we always had German Shepherds. So that's not a painting of my current German Shepherd or any of the German Shepherds. It's just a generic German Shepherd. But we've probably had, since our first German Shepherd, Rex, and I'm the one who's always had the German Shepherds, I've probably had 6 or 7 German Shepherds. And my dad had no problem with having them. He loved German Shepherds. And we asked him about that. And he said, it's not their fault. They didn't have anything to do with the German Shepherds that were used by the Nazis to terrorize people. So he loved German Shepherds, and his attitude, he really didn't. It's really amazing. He didn't hate the Germans. I think in some ways he had more problems with the Poles than he did with the Germans, because they were the Poles were the ones who would point out the Jews, and they were, of course, very anti-Semitic, and that's what he grew up with. But he didn't hold any animus toward German Shepherd dogs. He didn't hold any animus towards the Germans. I think he said that you can't hate, it just doesn't do any good. It was more important to remember and to learn the lessons from the Holocaust to make sure that it didn't happen again. So that's why, I love having German Shepherds.
I've noticed.
Yes.
Okay. All right. This next question is for Julie. Julie, Mark talked a little bit about this, and we'll come back to Mark as well, but can you talk about why you share your parents' stories? What is it that drives you to do that? And then how did you get started doing that? Because it's one thing to say, I want to tell my parents' stories, and it's another thing to actually do that. So talk a little bit about that, please.
Okay. The day my father passed away was really a pivotal moment in my life. Sometimes we don't realize what we have until it's gone. And the day he passed away, it just hit me that another witness is gone, another survivor is gone. And I didn't want his story to be lost. So I wanted to tell his story in a way that I could honor him and teach people about what happened to him. I actually started painting. I'm an artist, and I decided I was going to paint my parents' story and try to educate that way. And I used to have shows in synagogues, in churches, in schools, anywhere I could, just so that people could see and learn. And it was something that was so powerful when people actually got the message that I was trying to convey in the paintings. It helped me push forward. And so when I got more active with the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and we started talking about speaking as a second generation survivor, I was all for it. I knew I had to continue and tell my father's and my mother's stories before it's forgotten and before something like this, God forbid, could happen again.
How did you start doing this for both of you? And let's start with you, Mark. What were the first steps to beginning to tell your father and your father's story, and Julie, your father and mother's stories?
I was just looking in one of my files. The first time I spoke, believe it or not, was in 1981. Mm-hmm. I was asked to speak before a Jewish women's group who back then was called Pioneer Women. And I was asked to speak about being a second generation. And I was just kind of looking at some of my notes, and it was a very difficult speech to give, of course. And I really didn't speak that much afterwards because my dad was speaking. I didn't need to say anything. And of course, he was the one who was going around speaking. I would say I started speaking more towards the end of his life, and of course after he passed away, partly because there's the Holocaust Center, and partly I felt that it was kind of my responsibility and my honor to talk about my father and his experience, and to educate people. And part of that is also, there's so much hate in the world, and I just wanted to let everybody know that you can go through horrible experiences, but you don't have to hate the people the perpetrators. You just have to remember, and you also have to go ahead and my dad was very big about this. You just have to go and make the best life that you can for yourself. You can't get stuck in everything that happened to you, because you defeat the people who abused you and hated you if you don't go on with your life and do good things. And that's what I try and help. That's what I try and carry on for my father. And so I speak whenever I'm asked at the Holocaust Center, and hopefully I'll be able to speak more often, not only through the Holocaust Center, but through other organizations. But I would say that while my dad was alive, I really didn't speak that much, because it was his thing. And I'm very happy to be able to do that now. Okay.
And Julie, you already started talking about the fact that your father's passing kind of sparked something in you. Can you go a little bit further into that? Because your mother was still alive at that point, correct?
Correct. My mom was still alive. But for some reason, my mom, she had a lot of health issues and a lot of depression. And, I realized that I will be the one who will continue their stories. And in talking to Charlotte at the museum, we came up with the plan that second generations will speak for their parents. And I believe Charlotte and I spent over a year putting together my PowerPoint. And it was difficult. It was very difficult to put it together. And I wanted to tell it in a way that would make them seem like it could be anybody in the community. It could be the parents of the kids who are coming there, or it could be them. I wanted to make the story very real and alive, so that they would feel like, oh my gosh, this could happen to anybody. They were, my parents were just regular citizens. They thought they were great citizens in their country, in Hungary, and all of a sudden they were outcasts. And so I wanted to tell their story in such a way that people would feel connected to them.
Okay, so this is the final part of this question, then we'll move on to the next question. And this is actually for each of you. And I guess, Julie, I'll ask you to go first this time, and then Mark, you follow Julie, which is, you both have siblings, and yet each of you became the one specifically who told your parents' story. Why? What do you think accounts for that? And the reason I ask is because we see this in many second generation families, that there's one child who kind of takes the mantle of their parents' story on. So Julie, what was it that drove you to this and not your brother, do you think?
I wish I could answer that early, because I am the one who took on the story of my parents. When I first came out with my paintings, and my brother looked at them the first time, he just looked at me and said, I don't know where you're getting this from. He was completely disconnected. And maybe it's because he was older than I am, 7 years older than I am, and he kind of lived through their trauma a little bit more. Not sure. But for me, it took over my life. It actually did. When my father passed away, I just knew that this was going to be my mission, to educate and to teach their story. And he has never he never understood why I was so involved and why it's so important for me. But my children now, I think, will carry on after I'm gone. I've made it a point to teach them and to have them understand. And I believe that either one of my kids would be happy to continue on with the legacy. They're both very, very proud of their grandparents and really, really appreciate their heritage.
And Mark, in your case, because you're one of 4 siblings, correct? So why
Yes.
you?
I think probably because I'm the one who expressed most interest in doing this from early on. So I'm the one who got to do it. I do know that my other siblings, when they're asked about it, they'll talk about it with their friends, and they're not, shy about it. But I'm the one who just speaks more publicly about it, and hopefully we'll be able to bring in my siblings at some point, because I think it'd be kind of interesting to have like a panel of the 4 of us or something, and see how we each experience my dad's life differently. And then I'm also, I have 4 nieces, and they seem much more interested in also speaking in their own way. Rivka is part of the Holocaust Museum, and she doesn't really speak publicly that much because I can't say that she's been asked, but when she's asked to talk about it, she does. And Sarah, who lives in Florida, again, talks about it whenever she's asked, and she's written some really wonderful poetry about my dad. And my other 2 nieces, Lisa and Aviva, when asked, will talk about it. So as far as I go, I was the one who just stepped up. And so I got to do it. And I think also being the oldest, that may have something to do with it also. Let the oldest do it.
Okay. So the next question that I have speaks to Holocaust memory more specifically. You're both the children of survivors. And so you each have a unique perspective on Holocaust memory and kind of shared Holocaust memory across society. And I'm wondering if either of you has noticed changes in which in the ways in which the Holocaust is remembered in the United States. And then Julie, I have a sub question for you once we've answered that. So Mark, would you start? In other words, over your lifetime, what have you witnessed as changing ways that the Holocaust is memorialized or remembered in the US?
I think it's kind of a lot harder to talk about it, in the sense that Americans are known for having a very short historical memory, and of course there are very few survivors left. Back in the day when the Holocaust Center, for example, had basically a nice group of 10, 20 people who could go out and speak, and that really brought it home to the people who were listening to them. There's a direct connection, with the Holocaust, and of course now there's not as much of a connection. One thing that I've been very fortunate about is when I have spoken, I've had people come up to me who will tell me that they heard my dad speak when they were in high school, 30 or 40 years ago. And I think that really helps the connection. And if they're teachers, it helps connect with their students. And I think as we get further along, it's just going to be more history than it was before. And that's kind of too bad, but that's just the reality of the situation. It'll be our job to make it really relevant. And I think that the way we do it, like Julie was saying, is we want to bring home the fact that it could happen to anybody. It could happen to you. And, bring and talk about how there's, racism and issues all the time in America and around the world. And to make it personal to the people who are listening to us, I think helps them understand what the Holocaust was about.
Julie?
I grew up in Israel, and when I grew up, my parents moved to Israel in 1949, and at that time, everybody was a survivor. When I was born, we lived in an agricultural community, a moshav, on the border of Syria, and everyone in that community was a survivor, and so there was really not any talk about being a survivor. These were young survivors, young pioneers. They wanted to rebuild their lives. They wanted to build a new country. They didn't want to talk about it, at least not in front of the children. My parents never spoke. Unlike Mark, my parents never talked about the Holocaust or what happened to them. If I would ask questions about why I don't have grandparents or why I don't have an extended family, my parents would just change the subject or would say, oh, you don't need to know about that. Or they would talk about family when they were alive, when my parents were young, and situations like that, but not really tell the story. And plus in those days, there weren't any Holocaust Remembrance Days back then. I think most people at that time didn't want to know about it, didn't want to hear about it. They knew there were atrocities. They knew there were horrible things that happened, but they really didn't want to hear about it. It wasn't until I was already here in the US that we started having, Remembrance Days, Yom HaShoah and and the International Holocaust Day. It wasn't until many years later that it started. And of course, now we hear about it. Now it's an annual thing that the community participates in. But back then it wasn't acknowledged. It wasn't even a subject to talk about.
Okay, so you kind of combined the two questions that I wanted to ask you, because I know that things have changed in the way the Holocaust is memorialized in the United States. But things have also changed, as you started talking about, in the way the Holocaust is memorialized in Israel as well, from the founding of the state to now. Do you have any sense of the difference between the way the two countries and the two societies memorialize the Holocaust? I mean, is there anything there that you have thought about? Just curious.
Absolutely. I think in Israel, it's become a very important part of education. In Israel, they start Holocaust education in kindergarten. At a very young age, they teach the kids. And usually by the time they're in high school, they're even taken to Poland and they visit the camps. And so it's become much more than when I grew up. It's become part of society. It's become part of the education system. Here in the US, it has a long way to go, I believe. I think we're lucky to be in Texas. Texas has the Holocaust and Genocide Commission that makes sure that there is Holocaust education in the schools, but I don't believe every state has that. I think we have a long way to go to still educate the kids and the adults about the Holocaust and genocide and what the signs are and what to look for. We have a lot of work to do.
Okay. I'm sure that you've been there for this. I don't know if you have, Mark, but
Yeah, I have.
For anybody who's ever been to Israel on Yom HaShoah,
Yeah.
so on the day of Holocaust Remembrance, that's the official one on the Israeli calendar. It's in the spring. It's between March and April. It's always around the time of Passover. And it's just remarkable. The sirens go off nationwide and traffic throughout the country, which in terms of population is larger than DFW, grinds to a halt. People get out of their cars, get out of their 18-wheel trucks and stand in the middle of the highway, in the middle of the streets of Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem, and just bow their heads in a moment of silence as the sirens go. I mean, it's really something remarkable, and you'll never see that in the United States for very good reasons. But it definitely is something that affects the Israeli populace. So my next question for both of you is, how did your parents' experiences affect you as you were growing up, or did they? And then how do they affect you now? And this time, let's start with you, Mark, and then Julie. So how did your parents, and particularly learning what your father had gone through as you were aging, how did that change you, or did it?
Well, I think the first thing, and Julie talked about this a little bit as well, was, of course, we didn't have, well, my mother, of course, is from Dallas, and her father lived with us, but basically we didn't have any relatives. We didn't have uncles and aunts, and three of the four my dad's parents had died. And I think all four of us looked with a little bit of envy at our friends who had uncles and aunts and cousins and grandparents, and were amazed at how they took them for granted. So one of the things that we grew up with is not to take our relatives for granted. And it never ceases to amaze people that I talk about relatives of mine who go back like 3 or 4 generations before they were actually siblings. So we're talking like 100 years ago when they were siblings, and we're in touch with the relatives down the road, and that really blows everybody's mind. And that's part of my parents doing, valuing your relatives. It doesn't matter how far down the line they are. And we really cherish not only our relatives, but also our friends. And then as we were growing up, and we were lucky because Dad spoke about it all the time. And he also spoke in such a way that we weren't afraid of the Germans. Even though we would never have a German car, we would never have a Mercedes, we had German Shepherds. And I think that really impacted us a lot because we grew up, just you take people for what they are. You're tolerant, you love them no matter what. And there was no reason to dwell on, of course, it was a horrible time for my dad. He lost everybody, but he didn't dwell on it as something that was just awful, awful, awful. He was more interested in raising a family, speaking to people, being in a business. I mean, I think as we grew older, we really appreciated that in him a lot more, because he gave us a great grounding in Jewish life and synagogue life and in our Judaism, and also a great grounding in how to treat people. And I think that was a great lesson that he taught us. And if he could have very easily gone the other way, because I certainly know a lot of people like Julie whose parents never spoke of it, and they felt a real absence in their hearts that they never knew all that about their parents. So I'm very grateful to my dad that he taught us about his life.
Julie, how about in your case? And I know it was somewhat different because Mark's father came to the United States. Your parents went to Israel and settled in a survivor community in Israel. So it's a whole different, it's a different surrounding situation. So what was it like for you growing up surrounded by survivors and having survivor parents? How did it affect you?
I think when I was growing up, it did not affect me. We didn't, as a child, you don't know, and they didn't talk about it. And every one of my friends was a child of survivors. Their parents, I would go visit them in their homes. They're all survivors, but they didn't talk about it. It was very light, and I had a wonderful childhood. I'm still in touch with many of the kids I grew up with back there. It wasn't until we moved to the US, I was 12 when we moved to the US, and things changed. My parents became very protective. My father did not allow me to have non-Jewish friends, did not allow me to forget dating non-Jewish men, but very protective. And I remember my mother mostly worried about if anything happened, anything in the news that would happen, that it would be the Jews who are blamed for everything. So every time something happened, I remember when Kennedy was assassinated, we were still in Israel. I remember my mom, her head was buried in her hands, and she was, oh my God, I just hope it wasn't a Jew. I just hope it wasn't a Jew. And so, but that's how it was with everything that happened. I just hope it wasn't a Jew, and because of the trauma that they went through. And, I didn't really know their full story until I was about 40 years old, when Steven Spielberg went around the world and interviewed survivors for the Shoah Foundation. I finally put my foot down and I told my parents, you're going to do this. If you don't do it for me, do it for your grandkids. And so they finally gave their testimony. And even then, I wasn't allowed into the room. My parents insisted that I would not be there. And only a few weeks later, I got 2 VHS cassettes from the foundation. And then I sat down and I watched the entire thing. And that's when I learned what happened to them. And of course, you know, that in itself was life-changing. I understood my parents so much more. I understood why my mom was always very depressed. She never really got over being the victim. And, you know, growing up with that, it's like a dark cloud in the house, even though you don't know why. And so I understood all of a sudden, you know, what was all of this about. And, you know, it changed me. It really changed me forever. And I think now I'm probably a little bit like that with my own kids. You know, I'm very watchful. I have to know where they are. I'm always worried about what's happening around us. And I think that's been passed on from them.
Okay. All right. I have I think a final question for each of you. And it's not necessarily an easy question. We started by talking in Mary Pat's opening remarks about the hostage situation at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville that, thank God, did not end in the death of the Jews who were taken hostage. But the bottom line is it brings home, with an exclamation point at the end of it, the continuing existence of anti-Semitism, that it simply hasn't gone away. And that in many ways it's grown stronger around the globe. So the question for each of you, I'll ask you first, Julie, and then you, Mark, is, from your perspective, what can and should we do to fight against anti-Semitism and prejudice and hatred today? Because they're still here.
Yeah. Am I going first?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It's a very tough question. And because anti-Semitism is not something new. It's been around for over 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. And it's passed on from one generation to the next. In the US, it's really disturbing how anti-Semitism has grown. I know you mentioned the Colleyville situation last week. A couple of days ago, I heard that in Brooklyn, New York, an 8-year-old child was walking on the street with his siblings, and this woman came running up to him and yelled at him. First, she spit on him, and then she yelled, "Hitler should have killed you all." This is Brooklyn, New York. This is today. And, you know, I really believe the internet has a lot to do with it. It's a cesspool where things can be said. There's no one, you know, I'm not for censorship, but I'm worried that because it's not censored and it's not monitored, anti-Semitism and any kind of racism can grow and can, you know, fester under the covers for years and years until it pops its head up and we see things like these happen. I think we have a lot of work to do. I think churches, synagogues, and mosques need to bring in education about the Holocaust. They need to be honest and educate their congregants. I think our schools, our universities, today, Jewish students in the universities are afraid to wear a Star of David to show their Judaism. They're afraid because they become targets. This is very disturbing, and I'm afraid that I don't think these universities are addressing the problem. They're hiding behind it, and we as the Jewish community needs to make sure that we educate the public, that it becomes part of the everyday conversation. It has to become, it has to be approached in a way that people will understand what the price is. I'm afraid that we are in a really bad situation today here in the United States. I'm not even talking about around the world, because we know in Europe, anti-Semitism has been going on for years and years. And I believe it mostly comes from the homes. You know, kids are not born hating. They are taught to hate. And where are they taught? It has to come from the home. One generation passes it on to the next. And so it continues and festers and grows. And I think we have an awful lot of work to do. I wish I had a better answer for you on how to deal with it. But it's a big problem.
Mark?
Yeah, it's kind of scary, you know, that it's becoming more and more of a problem. Very thankful that the hostage situation resolved itself favorably. It could have easily gone the other way. And I worry about copycats. But as far as, I think that part of it needs to come from the top, where the government, you know, points out the anti-Semitism and lets people know that it's totally unacceptable. I think that we need to have dialogue with churches and mosques and other religious organizations and civic organizations to explain and educate people about what anti-Semitism is. I think a lot of people don't understand what it's all about and what some of the triggers are and how people say things which they don't know to be anti-Semitic. And we need to educate people about that as well. And in the schools, not only to starting at a young age, you know, we have to be really careful about that. But, you know, teaching about anti-Semitism and racism and how this can be prevented. And also, I think, and this is something that, of course, the Holocaust Center does about upstanders, you know, letting people know that we need to, that it's really imperative upon people to point out what's anti-Semitic or racist and educate our friends and our, you know, anybody out there and let them know that that behavior and thinking is unacceptable. It's a tough job, but we have to keep doing it, and we're going to have to be doing it hundreds of years from now because it's always going to be there.
Okay. All right. Thank you. On that note, what I will say is nobody's, as Julie said, nobody's born hating. This is learned behavior. Any kind of hatred is learned behavior. And so educationally, politically, culturally, we all have our work cut out for us, no question. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today, both in Zoom and on Facebook, for coming to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day with us. Mary Pat, would you like to take us out?
I would. Thank you so much, Mark, Julie, and Sarah. You know, I just wanted to make sure that people are aware of the resources that we have on our website, Anti-Semitism Toolkit, where if you're speaking with someone who really doesn't understand the roots of anti-Semitism, or if you're really looking for a simple definition that you can easily convey with people, on our education page, you can find a toolkit for confronting anti-Semitism. And last year we had a 4-part series, a crucial conversation series on confronting anti-Semitism. And you can find that on our YouTube page, DHHRM YouTube page. They're great resources. It's a frightening problem. We received a email from the Community Security Initiative today that the Northwest Hills sort of Jewish community in Austin was papered with anti-Semitic flyers again this morning. So this is a problem in our community in Texas, not just around the world, and we all need to stand up to it and be a part of the solution. Julie and Mark, thank you for your work and speaking to students, for sharing your family stories with us today. It's just always an honor to learn from both of you. And all of you, thank you for joining us to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to honor our survivors. We hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.